Welcome to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence. Join me as we venture beyond the mat into the fascinating intersections of yoga and health. Each episode brings you candid conversations with the visionary leaders and practitioners who are truly shaping this field, sharing their stories, insights, and the profound impact of yoga therapy in action. In today's episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Deborah King. Deborah is a certified yoga therapist and the insightful founder of ReGrowing Our Wings, yoga therapy for survivors of relational violence. Beyond her dedicated private practice, she partners with the Dove Project, creating vital yoga therapy offerings for survivors of gender-based violence. She also holds the unique privilege of creating specialized practices for people navigating multiple sclerosis, cancer, and postnatal mental health challenges through Swedish medical centers. And we'll talk more about that. Her recent article, When Safety is a Privilege, Not a Choice, Yoga Therapy with Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence, was on the cover of the 2024 winter issue of Yoga Therapy Today. It's so great to have you here today, Deborah. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here and excited about the conversation.
Well, let's just start by having you share a bit more about yourself, perhaps what initially drew you to yoga, and then specifically the path of yoga therapy, especially given your focus on interpersonal trauma.
Absolutely. So I like to start just by sharing some of my identities because it's just the lens through which I see the world. And then that allows people to kind of know what my lens is. And also, it opens me to being able to be accountable to anything I might miss in lenses that I'm not. So I am a white, queer, cisgender, single mother. I consider myself multi-ethnic. And all those things, really factor into the way I see the world and the way I approach practice. I'm also autistic with ADHD, and that also really informs the world for me. And that's kind of a new understanding for me, how neurodivergent I am. So those are kind of some of the ways I come to this world. So I began practice when I was really little, like a baby. My mom was a dancer and a yoga teacher, a creative movement practitioner, a massage therapist. So I grew up practicing with my mom. And so, my earliest memories are like bicycling upside down and shoulder stand. She was very playful with me. She also did a lot of early childhood stuff. And also the Ananda Marga temples in Virginia, where we were briefly when I was 4. And what I mostly remember is chanting and then going and playing ping pong upstairs while the adults were meditating. But I was kind of immersed in this world in various ways from a really young age. My mom also has MS. And while we didn't know that for several years, I grew up watching her adapt her practice according to what was happening in her body. So I think, that really fed it's natural to adapt practice for what's happening in you. And I learned a lot. My mom she wasn't credited as being a yoga therapist at the time, but she really was doing a lot of this work in the 70s and 80s in California. Mm-hmm. So, I really consider a huge influence on the ways I approach things. And I've learned so much from her journey.
That's so special. I just want to acknowledge that. Yeah.
It really is. It's really, really special to have that connection with her. And then as I grew up, I had no plans to teach yoga at all whatsoever. I was not going to be my mom. I was training to be an actress from a very young age. And when I was training, we had yoga as part of our curriculum, both in high school. I went to the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts, and then I went to acting school later. And I loved, it really grounded me and helped me. And it was a much more physical practice, at that time than what I do now. But it grounded me and it's remained part of my life. My intention was just to practice. And I guess to fast forward several years, I was a professional actress for a long time. But when I was pregnant with my first child, I was teaching acting classes to kids at an art center. And my agent, who was also teaching there, was like, Deborah could teach yoga to the kids. She's not working a lot. She's really pregnant. Um, and so I went and taught yoga to the kids during this camp, and I loved it. That was like my first teaching class. And then they said, hey, the next year, um, I had been through this whole thing with having my first baby where I expected to go right back to work. I didn't quite realize how much I would just need just to be wrapped around this little being. So I didn't want to leave him. And so they were like, hey, come back. You can bring your baby with you. So I brought my baby with me to teach again at class, and the kids were so sweet with him, and he loved it. And so I just, wear him while I was teaching. I would nurse while I was teaching. And then that kind of just like somehow, like someone heard about me doing that in the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. I was in Chicago. It was like, hey, come teach some postnatal classes. You can bring your baby. So I started teaching postnatal while I was nursing my baby and showing some of the infant massage that my mom had taught me. And then I was invited to teach prenatal. And, I didn't have official training. I had a lot of profound mentorship. A studio I was teaching at, with two amazing teachers, Jenny Barron Fishman and Corinne Peterson. Names are like sometimes a struggle for me in the morning lately. They just were so generous with their knowledge. So my first kind of specialization ended up being postnatal and prenatal, and then I ended up teaching at Northwestern Hospital as well, prenatal.
What time frame is this?
I guess I was pregnant with my first child when I was 30, so this is 24 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I was teaching prenatal, and I became more and more aware when people would share their stories of the way trauma was held in the body, post-birth and also pre. So I should probably go back a little. In addition to being a lifelong practitioner, I'm also a lifelong trauma survivor. So I have a complex history of trauma from childhood. And I like to talk about this directly, so there may need to be a little bit of a trigger warning. But I openly disclose that I'm a survivor of childhood sexual assault. I'm a survivor of repeated sexual assault, stalking, and intimate partner violence myself. And so I feel that my practice in many ways allowed me to navigate my life. And in some ways, I think I used my practice early on to kind of bypass some of the things that I was actually dealing with. And I think, that became very important in the development of my work with survivors, which is, comes always back to how do we honor what's happening. Mm-hmm. So both of those are kind of lifelong things. And as I started teaching more and working in these populations, I became more and more curious about different therapeutic aspects. So I hadn't done a teacher training yet. I'm just teaching for like 2 years.
And by the way, like that's how a lot of it worked back then. And I totally understand that myself, right? As a person who's been teaching yoga for 20 years, that in the early days, it was sometimes hard to find yoga teachers.
Yeah. And I think also I just, was known as a practitioner as well. You know?
Totally.
So when my oldest was about a year and a half, my teacher, Miguel Latronica, offered me a work study scholarship to do the teacher training because I could not afford it at that time. So I did, and that was my first training. And the main teacher was Per Arez, who was already one of my teachers and was just, I'd studied with him for several years and was just a wonderful person to learn from. Such an extraordinary human and practitioner. And I was becoming more and more interested in therapeutics for myself. And then I was encountering so much, especially postnatal trauma histories coming up, or the ways things would happen around agency would affect people a great deal. And so Gabrielle Halpern, who's an amazing teacher, practitioner in Chicago, ran the yoga circle for many years as an advanced Iyengar teacher, came in and gave a presentation on therapeutics. And I just remember like, okay, I'm going there. And I went into class and I took class, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, hey, I have this apprenticeship. You just come and I show you what to do and you work one-on-one with people. So for 2.5 years, I studied with Gabrielle as my main teacher. So I would take class and then I would assist in what he called the gentle class, and people would come in with all kinds of things, neurological stuff, cancer, autoimmune stuff, injuries, mental health issues, all kinds of things. And he would pair us, usually one-on-one, sometimes two of us as one person, depending, and he would oversee and tell us what to give and how and why.
Yeah.
So it was such a profound gift and opportunity from Gabriel. He is just incredible, and that will always be one of the most unforgettable experiences and
Sounds
pivotal
so
experiences.
amazing. Yeah. Like the ideal way to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that, individual attention and
Mm-hmm.
being in relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
Gabriel, I think, he's a pretty intuitive guy. He would often end up pairing me largely with people who are navigating neurological, autoimmune things like cancer and mental health things. And even, some things like fibromyalgia, for example, wasn't really acknowledged as being real back then.
Yep.
And he kind of intuitively was like, I want you to go with them. I learned so much from the Anger tradition. And I have a very gentle way about me that I've tried to fight a lot through my life. And, he says, like, this is not the person to pair with someone who wants to be like, turn your foot that way, do this like this. He put me with people who needed a certain amount of, I think, kind of softness in their space. So perhaps ironically, perhaps not, those are many of the things that ended up just kind of boomeranging back to me later when I decided to do this full time.
Yeah. Yeah. Not
So
surprising at all.
that's a long way of I just feel like that was so pivotal, that period. And it really fueled my passion for yoga therapy and using the yoga therapeutically. So I started seeing clients, and I also, presented in teacher trainings. I did prenatal and postnatal modules for the most part here and there, and I was teaching classes. But I really found the individual work was really where that juice and the magic was being able to see and look at a person. I think, one of the most important things that Gabriel said to me in my training, I remember he was helping me assess, like he would have someone stand and he would be like, with their permission, be like, so what do you see? And he said, okay, what are you looking at first? And I'm like trying to look at the details of their alignment. And I'm like, what am I supposed to get right? How am I supposed to get
Yeah.
right? And he looked at me and said, Deborah, who is this person?
Mm-hmm.
Who is
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
person? Look at the person.
Beyond their
They're not
feet
a
and
condition. They're
yeah.
not a posture. They're a
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Lovely. And at some point you study with Joseph LePage too.
Yeah, yeah. So
And that's
that
how you and I kind
years
of were
later,
drawn toward
that's
each
how
other. Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'll kind of fast forward. There's a lot of years there. I landed in Seattle, and for a while I was doing both acting and teaching and parenting to kids. And I left my marriage, which was an abusive marriage, in 2015. I was like, okay, what do I do? And I was planning to go back full time as an actor. And, the work I got was all these offers to teach yoga. So I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing yet. I am literally just trying to survive and get one foot in front of the other. I will take whatever comes. And at one point, I thought I might be a cook in a daycare instead for more stability. But something in me was like, you know what? You need to just go ahead and ride in the other ways that there's room for change, there's room for possibility. I wasn't planning to go back into individual clients. I was in a very raw place. But a student of mine who I had worked with privately, and I had been running workshops, for hormonal balance, for depression and anxiety, and working with clients, but not in more extreme circumstances during that period, said, there's this person I know, and she's just had a stroke, and she wants to practice yoga. And will you go work with her? And I was not sure. I was like, I'm not sure if I can handle that kind of intimacy right now, that kind of the specific kind of intimacy that you have when you work with someone one on one. And she said, okay, but you're the only person on the island who can work with her. So just, think about it.
No pressure. Yeah.
And
You're
I
the only
went.
one, but no pressure. Yeah.
So I went and I fell in love with this person. I fell in love with doing this work again and remembering how powerful the most subtle practices are.
Mm.
You know? And the
Hmm.
way this person was able to meet the subtlety
Hmm.
in the place she was in.
Yeah.
And I was like, it was a pivotal time to experience that.
Hmm.
During this time, I was exposed to polyvagal theory. And it was incredibly important because what I had been taught about working with the nervous system is that you are always calming and stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system. And we're always getting back to that. And I noticed when I was safe enough to feel activated, when I was out of the house I had shared with my husband, I was needing to ride my sympathetic nervous system in a way I had never experienced.
Hmm.
And I was like, why is this happening? And it just so happened that a student of mine who was a trauma therapist, we ended up meeting so we could develop a program together, which we did, and teaching me about polyvagal theory. And for me,
Hmm.
it was profound. Not only did it dovetail so beautifully with the deeper philosophy of yoga and the gunas
Totally.
and the energy, but also it gave me a way of understanding my responses in a way that was far less judgmental than the dual systems had given me.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I started really diving into that. And I was still trying to figure out how I was going to get on my feet up
Mm.
by myself and support my kids. And my grandmother passed away and she left me some money. And I was like, okay, what am I going to do? I need to go to school. And I thought I was trying to convince myself, oh, I should be a therapist or a physical therapist because those are much more practical. But I was just like, my practice has been my anchor my entire life. And I love therapy and I love PT, and I've used both of those throughout my life. But like for me, it would just keep coming back to my practice is my anchor. This is where I want to go. And every time I tried to like look into applying to other more practical programs, something would just kind of awry inside me. And I would be like, you know what, there's something off in my body. So I started looking at yoga therapy programs and everything close to me. I mean, there were significant limitations on me at that time as a single parent. I couldn't commit to a program where I would have to like be there and not be able to make it up because I never knew if my kids would need me, if an agreement might be dropped that would make me need to be there for my kids. And so the local programs were just not going to be possible for me. So I found the program at Kripalu, and Per Perez, one of my teachers, had gone through that program, and as had Carla Duros, another wonderful Chicago teacher who I studied with. And I was looking for a program that was not tied specifically to one lineage of like posture, especially. And so I looked at the program and a lot of it resonated with me a lot. And also, even though I would have to travel all the way across the country because I'm outside of Seattle, there was flexibility. So I could do the modules as I could.
Yeah.
So that became where I went. I have two amazing sets of parents. So they were what made it possible for me to leave. It took, I could do one module at a time, and then I would need to come back to my kids. And I was, already working. So
Hmm.
I had
Hmm.
already kind of dovetailed back into both yoga and yoga therapy, seeing private clients and continuing to develop programs. So my student, Jennifer Kalashwitz, brought me to polyvagal theory, and I started in 2018. We were able to start a program that we co-taught together, her doing the education as a trauma therapist and me
Is
doing the
this
yoga.
the Regrowing Our Wings project?
Yeah, this is the first iteration of that. And it was Eight Limbs in Seattle
Oh,
supported
yeah.
that and
Yeah.
housed it, which was a huge gift. And
Well, let's
then,
talk a bit more specifically,
yeah,
if we can, maybe about that work and then also about your work at Swedish and what that looks
yeah,
like. So, the work with survivors of relational violence through Regrowing Our Wings and the Dove Project, like extremely
yeah,
incredible, impactful work. Maybe if you can, I think you were heading there just a moment ago, but elaborate on how yoga therapy, with its understanding of physiology and the nervous system, helps survivors explore and restory their embodied selves beyond the trauma narrative. So talk to us about all that if you can.
Yeah. So that first iteration was at 8 Limbs, and then I approached the Dove Project during my practicum, saying that I wanted to specifically develop this for survivors, and they supported that. They provided our first was the fall of 2018, and so the work developed out of my practicum, out of seeing people, specifically inviting in survivors of mostly of intimate partner and sexual violence, but also different kinds of relational violence, because there's a big spectrum. Domestic violence is also childhood abuse. And then there's also the spectrum of social trauma, which is important. So I think it's really important, like when we talk about the narrative, that trauma never happens in a vacuum, that interpersonal trauma, personal trauma is always housed within the greater system surrounding us. So it's important to recognize that often people most often impacted are people who have oppressed or marginalized identities. And also, these are the people who have less access to resources.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is really important in the context of what yoga therapy really is. And this is, I think, the mudra and the really subtle stuff. I got so much from Joseph and from the integrative yoga therapy program, being able to kind of channel those aspects. But really, to me, so much of yoga therapy is the holding of space. And what's required for that is for me to clear my lens. Who is this person in front of me? And is there anything in the way of my seeing them as whole? Because that's our job, is to reflect the innate wholeness of this being in front of us. That's what we're getting to, ultimately.
Yeah.
So for survivors, they are often, a lot of the thinking around survivorship is that, and I'm going to say we should just leave. But there are a lot of limiting factors around that. They may be social, they may be interpersonal. One thing that happens in the context of abusive relationships of any kind is something called appeasement. And Stephen Porges and several colleagues published an article in the beginning of, I think it was 2023, about replacing the lens of Stockholm syndrome or learned helplessness with appeasement. And what appeasement is you regulating an abusive person, someone who is enacting control over you by using your own nervous system to regulate theirs. And it's a very practical and powerful survival tool. Mm-hmm. So what many people see as weakness is a deep strength and a survival choice. And that's important because, some of the people I work with are not out of their relationship. I work with people who may be in their relationship. Many survivors go back several times. And I think it can be easy to be judgmental if you have not been there or you aren't understanding the social context in which this happened.
Yeah.
So a huge part of the development of my work was creating a space that aims to respect the autonomy survivors, the ability, the need for boundaries, and that it's always held within a really deep sense of choice, so that even when we don't control our circumstances, for this moment, I control where I put my hand. For this moment, I control where I put my foot. And the ability to gradually feel into our experience, because this is where our instincts live. We survive by going out of our bodies, right? I think it's important to recognize that. An active state of survival is a state of disembodiment. And so to reconnect in the ways that feel like safe enough is a really profound resource. So that is much of what I'm doing is, especially, 8 years later, is creating the space for people to hear themselves and to come back to themselves in little bits.
Yeah. And, circling back to what you disclosed there a few moments ago, in that trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. Same with healing, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
healing happens in community as well. And I think that's what you're speaking to right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being seen,
Mm-hmm.
being heard, holding space. These are all really important aspects of the healing experience, if you will. And I'm
Absolutely.
hearing you speak to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the word safety, is used a lot in trauma healing. And
Mm.
it can
Mm.
be an important word and is the word that I try to use only in context because, first of all, it can be loaded. It can be used as a grooming technique often for people. So it's loaded that way. But
Mm.
also, I think to me, a word that speaks to me is the word connection. So rather than telling people this is a safe space or you're safe here, which I don't control,
Right.
you know,
Right.
I
To some
hope to find a
extent,
place for
right.
connection,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a beautiful evolution of how we've been using that term, especially in a yoga environment. And I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah. Yeah. Because how could we know if someone feels safe or not? Yes, we're trying to establish that, and we can do things to move in that direction. However, we cannot know or guarantee.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also particularly interested in your specialized practice within major medical institutions. And I think the listeners to this podcast are probably curious about that too, since I know we have a lot of yoga therapists and yoga teachers that listen in and are always wondering about those types of opportunities and what they might look like. So I know that you create tailored yoga therapy for individuals navigating multiple sclerosis, cancer, postnatal mental health, and that's through work at Swedish medical centers. So perhaps you can talk to us more about the genesis of that partnership, and how do you see yoga therapy being integrated with such a mainstream medical environment, and what specific needs do you address for the folks in those populations?
Yeah, well, so in 2017, after I had started at Kripalu, one of the studio owners I work for, Suzanne Hutchinson, she knew of my passion for yoga therapy, and Swedish was the Swedish MS Center was had a long time yoga program, and the teacher was leaving. The wonderful teacher was moving back to New Zealand, and so they were looking for someone else. And Suzanne just, gave my name, not knowing that my mom had MS, not knowing my experience with MS at all, just knowing I love therapeutics. So I went in and I talked to, the teacher that I would be, Sharon, the teacher that I would be coming in for, and really connected with her and came into the center, and it was just, it was unlike any environment I had ever been in. The MS Center is a phenomenal place. Dr. James Bowen, the head neurologist, founded it because he wanted a place to address the whole person. So in addition to yoga, there's also music therapy, support groups, writing classes, like all kinds of things to address the whole person. So, I walked into the room and there's all these people and several wheelchair users, several mobility aid users, and there's just props kind of everywhere, chairs everywhere, and it was just such an open environment. It was not like she was up there dictating and teaching. She was involved and in relationship, and it felt just such a one. I remember just feeling like this feels like a creative thing, you know.
Mm.
And then when I, spoke with her about my experience, she was like, okay, yeah, I think I want you to be the one to do this. And so it's an incredible community. They're connected to each other. And while not all of them have MS, most of them are navigating some kind of neurological challenge. The classes are free and open to anyone. You don't have to be a patient there. And so I've learned, I would say, my work with MS, it the trauma work, it's all nervous system. So that's the thing that I think really ties
Mm,
together all of the work I do, even though it seems like I'm going in all these directions, it always comes back to this nervous system and the person being in relationship with themselves.
yeah.
So, my mom has been a huge resource. And of course, MS is different, like anything, it's different in every person. But in really, trying to understand, because I don't have MS in my body, I don't experience it. My students have taught me so much about their experiences and being in relationship with them, figuring out how to language things, how to address different things. And, also just it's been fascinating to find the ways that different responses kind of cross, like the way freeze responses in trauma have often, depending on the person, have a very similar kind of need trajectory and practice as something like spasticity in MS.
Hmm.
They're not
Hmm.
the same thing, but there's a nervous system component there that gives me a lens to kind of figure out like, okay, what do we want to play with? Let's see if this aspect works. So it's been a phenomenal partnership. I've been invited to present alongside the doctors and researchers in different events, and it's incredibly supportive. I expanded the program in 2020 with the help of Dr. Bowen and a grant from Kripalu, and that's continued. The hospital ended up taking on those extra classes as part of our regular programming. And then in the pandemic, in the middle of shutdown, the Cancer Institute reached out to my supervisor at the MS Center. It was like, we're looking for someone to do a class for people navigating cancer. And so, and I have some training through Gabrielle, through Kripalu, and then I hadn't taught a class for cancer, but I had several clients who had navigated cancer. And of course, it's a big thing. So you can't really say cancer
Sure.
is very big. So I talked with them and we started that program online right after the shutdown and the pandemic hit in 2020. And that's still running as well. And these classes right now are online because these are immunocompromised people who are still navigating COVID, and other things are still very real for these populations. And then I think it was 2023, the Swedish Center for Perinatal Bonding and Support was looking for a yoga person. And what they are is it's postnatal mental health care for birthing parents. And so again, my name was given and I interviewed with them, and it's been another wonderful partnership. So whereas with the MS Center and the Cancer Institute, those classes are largely independent. I run them and I come in and, I'm in relationship with the centers, but it's not like direct involvement. I get a lot of referrals from neurologists and PTs, but it's not, I'm not directly in there. With the perinatal center, it's run by these amazing therapists. And so I go in and we go over intakes together, and they let me know what's happening in the room. And then I create a practice for the 6 or so people who are there with their
Mhm.
babies. Um,
Yeah. It
so yeah,
sounds really, really needed and really wonderful resource and such a beautiful opportunity to serve. I love how you said that these places, or maybe it was just in regards to Swedish, they were looking for a yoga person. And it's so true. Like they don't know that they need a yoga therapist in a lot of
yeah,
these cases. You are a
yeah,
yoga therapist. They do need a yoga therapist, but they're looking for a yoga person. And that I think that's just kind of important message to all of us yoga therapists out there. If you don't see the job posting that says yoga therapist, let them know that they need a yoga therapist, even though they might say they're looking for a yoga teacher or a yoga person. Yeah, I know I'm digressing a little bit, but what you mentioned there
yeah,
really brought that up for me.
yeah. I think that is important. And I think they realize it's important, because, you know, gentle yoga without understanding spasticity, if you're working with someone with MS, is going to be, it's a very different thing, right? There's nothing general. Well, and every person is an individual and might need something different. It's really important to have people who understand something about the condition, even if, like I have like cancer, for example, is very big and I can't know everything about every kind of cancer. But when I know a little bit about what my students are navigating, then I can offer specialized things, right?
Totally.
And it's really important that people have people who understand what they're something about what their experience might be, because I am working with people who are in chemo, who may have just had surgery,
Yeah.
as well as people who have been survivors for many years. So
Right.
people might come in any place. And with the postnatal center, very like in the moment, like the ways that things that people might need are very, kind of on the fly. And you're often, the therapist will often take the babies, but sometimes they're in there. And so I'm also kind of navigating, the sea of babies. Sometimes I get to hold them. Yesterday, there was the most adorable experience that I think you might appreciate, which is there was a little crawler, and he's crawling around, and he did not want to be taken away from his mama. And it was such a feeling in the room, like just the parents there just were taking such lovely, there's a lovely feeling between them. So he's crawling around while I'm teaching and I'm like adjusting them. And then the last class, like I suggested putting support under the head, and he crawled over to another mother with a block and put it under her head. And yesterday we were doing Brahmari breath. We were doing humming breath, and he started humming with us.
Aw, he
He
was your
started
little
humming.
assistant.
He was just adorable.
That's so great. Well, let's maybe talk about your new workshop in Seattle that's coming up. And it's called Empowering Voices. We Are Already Whole. And it unites yoga therapy with coaching to bring ideas for systemic and social change into action. Well, that's really needed and incredibly powerful. So maybe, as we kind of do a roundup of all the different things you're involved in and with and planning, if you could just tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind this workshop and what participants might expect.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things that arises in the survivors that I work with is there's a lot of focus on kind of the external circumstances around survivorship and around like wanting people to be safe. And I'm using air quotes right now. And sometimes what gets forgotten is that there is a person, who has an evolving dharma, an evolving purpose within this experience. And as I've experienced myself, there comes a certain point where there is this deep understanding that their attention can stay there. And some of it needs to be, right? There are people who are in dangerous circumstances, but they have a lived understanding of the systems that they're in and the things that are not protecting them adequately, or the things that need to change for them to have access, or loved ones of theirs to have more access to resources. And some of them have ideas for ways to support other survivors. Some of them have ideas for art they want to create. Sometimes I think this kind of broad spectrum from chronic illness to trauma, there can be a lot of focus on helping. And, there's a certain point at what's really needed is for this being to be able to come forward with their own voice. And for me, this is really, the deepest aspects of yoga are where are we directing the energy of our healing? And you do that even within challenge. So I see people every day who are navigating chronic illnesses, who are directing the energy of their healing in various ways. So I've been asked for especially for people who want to make policy change, and I have no idea, how to tell someone how to lobby for a policy change, but their ideas are so amazing and insightful. For anyone who has not been through these systems, the systems in place to protect survivors are largely inadequate. There really is not adequate protection. And so putting a lot of energy into that at some point really becomes exhausting. So I don't know how to, talk to people about policy change. So I was like, oh, surely I can find this, I'm sure it's happening somewhere. So I'm looking and looking and looking, and I couldn't find anything. So I'm like, okay, well, I wonder how I can create this. And I started asking questions, and because I kind of heard this idea I was looking for a person to co-teach, and a dear friend of mine from high school, we've known each other since we were 15, does kind of leadership coaching. She's amazing. So her name is Lee Lester. She founded the Ubuntu Institute of Learning. She she coaches for all kinds of social change. She specializes in Black women's leadership and housing, especially around DV. She was appointed to the board of HUD. She is phenomenal. So she helps people bring their ideas into fruition. So at the time, I thought I would get a grant. Like I was applying for money. I was like, so I'd love for you to come do this. And I don't know if you could come in once or twice. And she was like, I'm going to come in. I'm going to come up to Seattle. She does not live here. And we're going to do this together. And so I ended up not getting any grant funding. I mean, this is like November after the election. You can't say trauma. You can't say racism. You can't say, And so I did not get money to fund it, but she was like, I'm still coming. And I was offered space by Swedish, and I want to be a little bit, the space is private, but fully accessible space was essential because so many survivors have injuries or are disabled. So that was offered, and referrals were offered. And it was just like, okay, I have nothing like funding this, but something is driving me. It just feels like the time is now to do it. So we start next week. I'm so excited. And so it's really a place to unite yoga therapy. So the first few weeks will be with me, learning the basics kind of stabilizing, and also spending time connecting to each other, journaling or making art, kind of bringing their vision forward. And then Lee comes in and it becomes, a little touch in of the yoga. And then she takes over the coaching sessions. So it's combining those things to bring their ideas forward.
Wow, Deborah, you are doing such amazing and needed work. And the more I get to know you, the more I get to learn about that. And it's just really awesome. And I want to thank you for everything that you're doing. So needed, especially now. Yeah. Well, let's talk maybe as we close here about your own practice. And so we know as yoga therapists that we have to start with us and our own stability that we can get through practice. And you did talk about how important that's been for you in your life. What does it look like on a daily basis? What does it look like as you age? I think you and I are the same age. I'm kind of deducing that in some things that were shared. And I know over the years, my practice has changed as I've encountered menopause and all that too. So tell us a little bit about what your personal practice or sadhana looks like.
Absolutely. If it's okay, I wanted to just read like a quote question from a student, because I think it'll dovetail in and kind of maybe meld like what I've said. So I asked a few of my classes, like, if you wanted to hear me speak about something, what would it be? And so this particular student kind of coalesced like some of the feedback I got really beautifully. It also means a lot to read. So the question is, how are you able to help someone engage with their body when their body may be a source of long-standing or chronic discomfort, pain, trauma, and or limited mobility? It's such a gift, and I'm sure the result of much study. I'm so very grateful for what you provide. And so the reason I wanted to kind of start talking about my own practice from that place is because I think that's really the root of it, is there is a balancing between, I think ultimately really so much of yoga is about where we direct our senses. So when people are in an extreme place of trigger or trauma or pain, they may not be able to stay directly with their body. So I often offer ways to come out, ways to do that consciously. And so to me, all of it comes down to choice, because we may need to choose to dissociate sometimes. That is a survival response that has a lot of resource in it. So when I'm working with someone, it's not just about getting them out, but about creating space for them to be accompanied as they experience whatever they're experiencing. So then their nervous system starts to play that role for them over time.
Yeah.
And so, I found this question to be really profound and meaningful, because that is a lot of what I'm doing. It's like, yes, you are in this challenge and it's real, And at the same time, there's this other part of you that is capable of feeling something else. And all of those things are your wholeness, not just the good feeling, not just the challenge. All of this is your wholeness. That's kind of where I come to all the work, where all of it kind of comes together. And in my own practice, this has been pivotal because I had to come to a place where I could be with the things that have happened in and to my own body, where I could recognize not just the pain from the trauma, but also, the resources that I had to get through those things. It doesn't make navigating chronic PTSD easy, but it allows me, again, to direct the energy of my healing. So when I think of practice, I think of pratyahara as the root of it, because it's the direction of the energy of our senses. So sometimes we are going out so that we can come in eventually. That may take a while. I study now in the Shakta Tantra tradition, and the way I've heard Dr. Kavita Chinayan describe it is when Shakti is turned toward Shiva, that's transcendent, and Shakti is turned towards the world, that is immanent. And so my practice is often first thing in the morning is some kind of a meditation. What it is my evaluation first of where my need needs to go.
Yeah.
And then I loop it into that place. So I often will begin by chanting or meditating in some way. And just as I allow I think flexibility is, one of the most important things in yoga therapy. And it's one of the most important things for my own practice. So that is my non-negotiable. And then as a fully single parent, sometimes I have 2 hours. Sometimes I have no time at all whatsoever. I need to do some kind of physical movement every day to stay grounded, to stay with my body, to stay with my intentions. What that is could be a breath-led movement for 5 minutes, or it could be a bunch of handstands, depending on where my nervous system is living. And then I also always come back to breath work, at least by evening. Sometimes my practice is like all at once. I see, usually I usually do about 4 sessions a day, and I need time between those sessions to check in one way or another. So practice is also inherently woven into my life to stay alive.
Totally.
One of the most important things, and this may be useful to people, has been since the inauguration, because I am working, I would say, exclusively with people who are directly impacted. Like I've described it as being a tidal wave, is I needed to develop a ritual. My therapist helped me do this, to find a ritual that didn't take a lot of time at the end of the day, because I come home and I'm with my kids, I'm making dinner, I don't have space, So when I come home, I light a candle and I feel into the people I've been with, and I feel into myself, and I gently disentangle my own body responses from those of my clients, hold space around myself, hold space around them, and then I can move back into caring for my kids and connecting with them.
Yeah. So wonderful, so beautiful. And again, thank you so much, Deborah. I really loved our conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Thanks again for listening. If you're interested to learn more about who we are and what we do, check us out at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.